we are. Minor technical glitch this afternoon. Maybe it's the All Hallows Eve imminent, which is messing with
the
the
unexpected.
Yes, exactly. Well, all right, we got people rolling in now. Great. Well, I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. Gosh, when did we meet, Patrick? It was just a couple of years ago, I think.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we had a long drive through the rainy night
In Wales. Yeah. Every now and then you meet somebody who's just like, I mean, polymath, what's the right word? Just, has done so much in their life, has covered so many bases. You just want to talk and ask questions and any rabbit hole you go down, he's got insights. So Patrick is one of those people who I could interrogate for dozens of hours, and at some point perhaps we'll be able to on the record just to unravel all the things he has to offer. But today we've only got 1 hour for presentation. So I'll let you take it away, Patrick, and very much look forward to the conversation in an hour. For those who are not yet versed with the protocol, which most people probably are, please feel free to chat in the chat box with each other, and any and all questions you'd like me to direct to Patrick during the Q&A portion, please post in the Q&A box. All right.
Well,
We'll
Dan,
take it away.
Thank you very much for inviting me to the Bionutrient Food Association conference. I'm so delighted because I think we can really connect an awful lot of dots. I'm a psychologist originally, but I've spent the last 45 years exploring what it is to be human, and it led me into nutrition. So it could be what it is to be a plant. And thanks to Dan's wonderful guidance, where I live in the Black Mountains of Wales, we have about 0.6 of an acre, growing some delicious and wonderful food, surrounded by fantastic creatures, from otter to owls to crested newts, dormice, and 6 different species of bats. And we're developing the concept of beyond organic. We are organically certified, which I think the standards are a bit higher in the UK. But we're beyond that because we're applying the principles that Dan has taught us about soaking all our seeds in that microbiome mix, but first of all, getting the mineral levels right in the soil, which was a passion of mine right from the start here at Forest Mountain Retreat in the Black Mountains. So I want to explore this soil, food, gut, brain superhighway and the parallels between plants and us, really to connect, and that's what I hope, the concept that we eat something because it's going to deliver some value to us. And really, one of the first great inspirations for me was Darwin, because Darwin said that there are 2 forces driving evolution. And one are the conditions of existence, and the second, natural selection. And in everything he wrote, the conditions of existence is the more important. I was in London the other day watching a fox play in the garden. Now, there are no badgers there. We have badgers here. So urbanization, great for foxes, bad for badgers. That's natural selection. But first, the conditions have to change for natural selection to kick in. And when I was studying psychology, I came across this fundamental concept generated by Dr. Linus Pauling and Dr. Abram Hoffer, who became my teachers. And they had published a paper in 1968 in Science Journal, the provision for the individual person of the optimum concentrations of important normal constituents, nutrients of the brain may be the preferred treatment for many mentally ill patients. So, we think of that with the soil. What are those optimum concentration of nutrients necessary to grow good food? And I was honored because Dr. Linus Pauling, who had 48 PhDs and 2 Nobel Prizes, became the patron of our Institute for Optimum Nutrition. They called it orthomolecular medicine, the right molecules. I thought that was a bit hard to convey, so called it optimum nutrition. And a friend of mine, Jeffrey Bland, he started functional medicine also as a student of Linus Pauling. And recently, Professor David Smith, the Vice Dean of Oxford Medical School, and I were writing about the misconception in nutrition that deficiency means a lack of efficiency. And if the definition of nutrient deficiency and its counterpart, sufficiency, were to be defined as the level of a nutrient that relieves symptoms of disease. And that's what we've been doing at the Institute for Optimum Nutrition, which is a not-for-profit charity that offers a degree accredited training, which takes about 4 years. And one of the first concepts that I had, which really came from the brilliant philosopher Oscar Ichazo, and basically he developed what's called trialectics. Dialectics, in effect, says there's a state like the ruling classes, and you oppose the state. Working classes attack ruling classes. You have a revolution, and you create a new classless society. That was the dream of communism, but it sort of didn't quite work. Materialism comes from that as well. You know, I'm making cars. You can make cars bigger, better, faster. So the whole process of materialism and capitalism and expansion also comes from dialectics. And like, you know, with cancer, it's like I've got cancer, a state. I've got to chop it out, drug it out, burn it out. I have a new state, no cancer. Not realizing, and this was the point of Ichazo's trialectics, that in every action, there is a gain or loss of energy. There's always an attractive and an active principle. So the genes are the instructions that tell the hardware how to organize itself. They're like the active and attractive principle. And the function is to adapt to health. So if you fail to adapt and you're sick, then you know that your total environmental load, your conditions of existence have exceeded your genetic capacity to adapt. So I applied that model to nutrition. Everything above and below is made of 4 elements in space: earth, air, fire, and water in space. And if you really think about it, everything that we experience is experienced in the space of consciousness. If you hear a plane going ahead, where are you hearing the plane? Are you hearing it in the plane? You might say in my ears, but that's just a concept that you've been given. Everything we experience in the space of consciousness. All this exists in our consciousness. And the Greeks were very switched on to this. That 5th element they called ether, and they associated the elements with the Platonic solids. And, you know, we have a triangle, downward, fire, sexual, earth, yellow, cube, physical, air, hexagonal, octagonal, emotional, water, intellectual, ether, spiritual. And this might sound like, you know, nice ideas, but it's really rooted in the very nature of who we are. For example, it is just a fact that we have 5 cavities. We have the pelvic cavity, which contains all our reproductive sexual organs, and we have the abdominal cavity, which processes food for energy, and we have the thoracic cavity of our lungs and our heart, which, you know, is this kind of exchange system, and we have the cranial cavity, which contains the brain. But then we also have the dorsal or vertebral cavity of the higher brain centers and the spinal cord, which connects everything. So this is literally how we are. It's not just a nice idea. And this 5 system is very, very prevalent in all of nature. We see 5s everywhere. And if you look at the structure of DNA, adenine or guanine, or you look at a tryptamine, which I happen to really like, serotonin, melatonin is a tryptamine, but a lot of these, you know, psychedelics like psilocybin, also tryptamine. You find a 6 and a 5. 6 usually is to do with structure of something, and 5 is the life of it. So I want to talk about where I've got to in nutrition or health, really, across 5 fundamental processes that I believe are also fundamental to the whole way that nature works and plants work. And we're going to kick off with glycation, sugar, generation of energy. We'll look at methylation, which is to do with B vitamins, especially folate, B6, B12. We'll look at oxidation and how we use oxygen and generate oxidants that require antioxidants. We'll look at lipids, fats, omega-3, vitamin D, and lastly, hydration, water. But of course, for these 5 processes to be healthy in us, we have to eat the right food, good nutritious food, and we have to digest and absorb it. So the 6th fundamental process is digestion and absorption. And that was something I first proposed in my book, The 10 Secrets of 100% Healthy People, which was also a study that we did on over 20,000 people. And built in that is the concept of resilience. And I'm sure this is exactly paralleled in growing food, that basically our health, and this comes out of resilience theory from systems-based science, that our health is like a basin, and some days we feel better than others. But if you start to lose that resilience, lose your blood sugar control, lose your oxidative stress resilience capacity, lose your digestive strength, and so on, it's like the basin becomes flatter, and now you can leave that state of health and go into a new, relatively stable state called disease. So you can live with diabetes or high blood pressure or many things for quite a while. And therefore, what you need to get back to health is far more energy than you need just to maintain it, far more nutrients. Similarly, if the soil is ravaged, what you need to do to regenerate that soil is far harder work, so to speak, than if it's good in the same place. So yes, we were talking, Dan and I, at the Green Farm Collective in the UK, and I loved his talk, and it taught me so much, really, from the soil to the plant. And I kind of take over from the nutrient to the health, and the 2 pieces fit very well together. And obviously, if you look at Dan's 5 principles, air, there's a direct parallel, water, food for metabolism, sugar equals fire equals combustion, minerals, earth, life. Supporting soil life, of course, has got a lot to do with the whole microbiome, which in a way is so vital for digesting everything. And his 6th principle, when we taught a workshop here at Forest Barn, was consciousness is the 6th principle, the attitude with which you approach everything that you do. And it really is quite extraordinary that in 1869, Mendeleev came up with the concept of the periodic table based on atomic weight and chemical properties of the elements that existed. And those were the only elements known in 1869. But he mapped it out and predicted we'd find many more. And, he was so right. So today the periodic table is, 5 times bigger than what was known in 1869. And what I find so interesting in looking at elements, and when you have something close together like copper and zinc in the human body, it's a little bit like they will drive an enzyme faster or slower. So copper antagonizes zinc, they're both necessary. So we look at these relationships like calcium, magnesium above and below each other. They have a fundamental relationship. But what's also really interesting is that 97% of our body is made from carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur, and nitrogen. And I think Joni Mitchell nearly got it right. She said, we are stardust, we are golden, maybe we are chosen, and we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. And I've been interested in these fundamental elements and how, for example, when you take a fat, which is a chain of carbons, omega-3 fat always is an omega-3 fat. It just gets more complicated. So it's like in that family. A carbohydrate can go from very, very simple sugar, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, in a particular relationship, and it will always be a sugar. It just becomes more complex. Methylation, which is to do with B vitamins, CH3, carbon, 3 hydrogens, water, obviously H2O, air, carbon dioxide and oxygen. Just these very simple elements. And then protein, kind of the building block of everything, is a mixture of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur. This is where the sulfur comes in, and nitrogen, which is so important. So where we've got to in relation to mental health is to talk about the 4 horsemen of the mental apocalypse. And the 4 horsemen, it is extraordinary. A recent paper showed that 43% of the world's population have disability due to neurological brain, mental health disorders, 43%. So brain fats, I want to talk about that. Omega-3s, phospholipids, methylation, B vitamins, I want to talk about that, glycation, sugar and how we generate energy and how that correlates with plants and oxidation, antioxidants, and so on. So we're going to kick off with glycation, the making of energy. I love this quote from Galileo. I'm sure you know it. The sun, with all those planets revolving around it and dependent on it, can still ripen a bunch of grapes as if it had nothing else in the universe to do. And here we are in solar maximum. That amazing planet is doing all these incredible things. And, we take it for granted, but there's a phenomenal process by which, with sunlight and carbon dioxide, and water, and of course a seed. We generate these phenomenal plants, which then produce oxygen and produce sugars, which we live off, and that within every single one of our cells, the hundreds of thousands of mitochondria, extremely intelligent beings. And they kind of are beings. They derive from bacteria. So we are symbiotic. That's really the origin of mitochondria. And by the way, the mitochondrial DNA is only inherited from the mother. So we're all more like our mother than our father. And that mitochondria is going to take that carbohydrate and oxygen and, in a way, combust it to produce ATP and give back carbon dioxide and water. And I realize one thing that's never quite in these diagrams is the oxidants created and how we deal with them, the reactive oxygen species. But I'll come on to them. So we need not only carbohydrate from plants, but we need to carry oxygen. And we happen to have chosen iron to do that. That's why our blood is red. So right there in the middle of hemoglobin, we have the ability to carry oxygen simply because we have prioritized a molecule using iron, red. Plants, on the other hand, they help to transport energy and generate chlorophyll with magnesium in the middle. These two, hemoglobin and chlorophyll, are so very, very close, with the chlorophyll having 3 methyl groups added, those CH3s, and magnesium instead of iron. Sugar and alcohol really are the opioids of the masses. This is what's creating a problem. And to just illustrate this in a study, long-term overconsumption of sugar starting at adolescence produces persistent hyperactivity and neurocognitive deficits in adulthood. As we lose our sugar balance, we develop a pattern of changes called metabolic syndrome, which is indicated by low level of HDL cholesterol, not a high level of LDL, but a low level of HDL cholesterol, elevated blood sugar, high blood pressure, excess weight in the abdomen, and high blood fats, triglycerides, generated from having too much sugar. So you have to put it into storage as fat. We need only a mere 4 grams of glucose in our 60,000 miles of blood vessels. That's all we need. And if you have a can of Coke, let alone a bottle, you've got so much sugar. So the body struggles to do something with it, generates fat. Often that fat spills out into the liver and you get fatty liver disease. And really it's internal global warming. I mean, I was up in Svalbard, Spitsbergen, kayaking with polar bears, and the polar bears are facing extinction due to global warming. So what do we do? Do we develop a drug that lowers a polar bear's body temperature, or maybe bring in some snow machines? And you go, no, we've got to protect the conditions of existence and the global warming and so on. And that's really what's happening to us. So we go and see our doctor, and they give you a drug for your cholesterol and your blood pressure and your weight and your stress and your mood and your memory, and you just accumulate drugs, which is very, very good for the pharmaceutical industry. But underneath is this change, this internal global warming, this metabolic syndrome. And in adolescence, I mean, this is extraordinary association between metabolic syndrome and young onset dementia. So this study shows that if you have metabolic syndrome, you have a 24% higher risk of young onset dementia. And in relation to adolescents, the extraordinary thing is that adolescents with metabolic syndrome, and there are many of them, not only have clear deficits in their cognitive abilities, but they also show similar shrinking of the central area of the brain, the hippocampus, that we see in people with dementia. And another study found that just a 15 milligram per deciliter increase in glucose, which is well within the reference range, measured during middle adulthood, is associated with 14.5% increase in Alzheimer's disease with a very high level of statistical significance. I mean, the youngest onset of adult onset type 2 diabetes is age 3, and the youngest age of non-genetic Alzheimer's diagnosis is age 19. And perhaps you know all of this, but one thing that's becoming increasingly clear is, I mean, the move from sort of sugar cane to corn syrup and high fructose corn syrup may not have been such a good thing. Fructose is the primary sugar in plants, and lovely, never given to you without fiber. And when you concentrate fructose in high fructose corn syrup, but also in fruit juices, I say to people, have you ever eaten 3 oranges like in one go? It's very rare that anyone has actually done that. Have you ever drunk a glass of orange juice, which is the juice of 3 oranges? Everyone's done that. So if you get too much fructose, you get fat storage, increased cholesterol, increased blood fats, neuroinflammation, all sorts of things that you really don't want. And sucrose is half fructose, half glucose. Glucose is actually what our body knows how to run on. Fructose in excess becomes toxic to the brain. It fills the mitochondria to make you crave sugar, but doesn't give you the same energy boost, which, by the way, is very good for sales because you can consume more fructose before your system says stop. But nature never gives fructose without fiber. And the fiber slows down its release, and some of that fructose gets to feed the healthy bacteria, so you actually take in less. Alcohol and fructose is worse, hence the sort of gin and tonic. We're adding sugar to our alcohol. Salt and fructose is worse. So crisps with salt plus alcohol. Red meat and fructose is also worse. So burger, chips, beer, absolute disaster. And that's what most people are eating. This was a very interesting study, which actually looked at how fructose reduces liver mitochondrial function, while glucose specifically stimulates it. So, this is a direct mechanism whereby the mitochondria kind of know what to do with glucose, but with fructose, it reduces it. There is a theory that actually pre-hibernation, we think of bears. I know we don't quite hibernate the same way, are actually designed to be attracted to eating tons of fructose. And ultimately, it makes you sleepy, not energetic, and it promotes storage of sugar as fat. So you get fat and sleepy, and then you hibernate. So it could be that we have a little bit of evolutionary hangover, so to speak. Now, of course, we don't just run on glucose, and particularly brain cells, neurons. They, if anything, they prefer ketones. So we can generate another high-intensity fuel, ketones, from fats, but very specifically medium-chain triglycerides. And our muscle cells can burn fatty acids, but neurons can't. They can only burn glucose or ketones to generate all that energy. And what we've learned in recent years is fats are chains of carbon, like olive oil contains, among others, a 14 carbon long chain. Well, butter, for example, has 4 carbons long. And somewhere in the middle is what we call MCTs, medium chain triglycerides, C6, C8, C10, C12. But it is actually C8 that produces nearly all of the ketones. In other words, in our liver, we have the ability to produce something that is not fat, not protein, not carbohydrate, but is direct fuel, especially for neurons. And it's made from C8. Coconut oil is only 7% C8. So what we've been doing is concentrating the 99.8% pure C8 as a brain fuel. And our genius scientist, Professor Stephen Kinane, has done some fantastic experiments feeding people 2 tablespoons of largely C8 and watching this explosion of increase in energy in the brain. And I should explain there that basically if your insulin mechanism is all messed up and you can't get glucose into brain cells, effectively you have brain fog. You have a lack of energy, and your brain will tell you that it needs fuel. It will tell you to eat something sweet. So as people approach increasing degrees of cognitive decline, what tends to happen is they say, I've got brain fog and I'm craving more sugar. And when we give them C8, 2 tablespoons of C8, that supply of energy is you get a 230% increase in energy in the brain produced from ketones, no change in glucose. So consequently, the craving for fuel goes down because the brain is satisfied. And as with every system, for some reason, nutrition is very deprioritized, but also macronutrition is kind of king. We talk about proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, and somehow ignore the micronutrients, the vitamins and minerals, which are essential. They're like driving so many of these processes. And if you, for example, lack zinc, or you lack magnesium, or you lack any of these nutrients, which may not be present in the soil and therefore are not present in your plants, then this whole energy machinery breaks down. So sometimes, it's frustrating. How do we get the message across, and how do we get it across to younger people? I mean, I remember my grandson, he was climbing up a cupboard to get the chocolate biscuits. And I said, no, Ramon, enough. You've had enough sugar. And he said, well, why? I like it. I like it. I said, that's a very fair answer. And I said, well, what you don't know, Ramon, is if you eat loads of sugar, you end up with this terrible disease called diabetes. He's 7. He said, well, what's diabetes? And I said, well, let's Google it. And I said, well, last year we had 260,000 amputations as a consequence of diabetes. And he said, what's that? And I said, well, they chop your leg off. And he said, well, how? And I said, with a saw. And he said, does it come back? And I said, no, it doesn't come back. That's why you need to eat less flat, less sugar. But how do you get the message across? So sometimes I write raps. I'm just going to give you a few lines to give you.
Food matters, the nation is getting fatter. Stop white supremacy, brown bread matters. Don't sweeten up the kids, they already sweet. Put your hands in the end, follow the beat. What? Fight the flower, fight the flower, yeah. Fight the white, fight the flower, yeah.
Anyway, you get the message. How do we get the message across? That's the thing. So, second principle to look at, oxidation and antioxidants. Isn't it amazing there are little organisms like Emiliania Huxley, which float around in the ocean and turn carbon dioxide, into oxygen. And every other breath you take, that oxygen is generated by organisms in the sea like this, even more than the rainforest and so on. So I really look forward to that understanding of the vitality of marine agriculture, not just land agriculture. In a sense, we used to be hunter-gatherers on the land, and we've become farmers. We've become agriculturalists. And right now we're hunter-gatherers in the ocean, and we really do need to become, marine agriculturalists. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So every day the Earth receives 50 lightning strikes a day. And this is it's free energy. It's a powerful antioxidant. I'm not sure if I can turn off the sound there, but nitrogen, the air is 78% nitrogen. That nitrogen is forced into the soil by this, and our soil is negatively charged, and we generate positive ions through our metabolism, and that's why standing on the earth actually changes your energy. It is a free antioxidant. So what are antioxidants really? Well, we combust that glucose with oxygen. All life depends on oxygen. Ultimately, it will generate oxidants, or reactive oxygen species, and they will damage us, they'll age our skin, and ultimately they will kill us. And vitamin C is a water-based antioxidant. It also disarms smoke. And vitamin E is a fat-based antioxidant from nuts and seeds, for example, and it disarms, French fries. And vitamin C will reload vitamin E once it's oxidized, and vitamin E can reload vitamin C once it's oxidized and put it back to work. And absolutely critical is glutathione. Think onions, garlic, eggs. And glutathione itself is recycled by anthocyanidins, which are in blue, red foods. And also vital are coenzyme Q, particularly ubiquinol, the active form of it, and lipoic acid. So these are the antioxidants that the team that keeps you healthy and young. So I'm 67 and I both supplement them and I eat them, and I really want to get all those strong colors. I get through a tub of mustard every month. I want turmeric, I want blueberries and beetroots and bright green, wonderful archaelas, phenomenal, and butternut squash and so on. So I'm always looking for the colors. But for reasons that will become clear in a minute, I also supplement vitamin C every day, and I'll explain why. So one of the big myths, I remember meeting a TV doctor here, and she said, I don't take supplements, I just eat a Brazil nut every day. I get all the selenium that I need. So I looked up the latest study on selenium concentration in Brazil nuts, and it was a 34-fold variation. And then I looked up, and the same paper actually had the selenium concentration in the soil where Brazil nuts grow. Had a 9.5-fold variation. So you have no idea when you eat that Brazil nut, whether it's a good one or a bad one. And of course, I'm talking to people who are well aware of this difference. And outside our cells, the most important antioxidant of all is vitamin C. It's absolutely vital. And when vitamin C gets spent and becomes oxidized vitamin C, it's reloaded by glutathione. And glutathione then becomes oxidized. And this relationship between ascorbate and glutathione is absolutely central to plant physiology. A very lovely paper, The Heart of the Redox Hub, Christine Foyer and Graham Nocter. And in this assessment of current knowledge, we highlight the central position of ascorbate glutathione cycle in the network of cellular redox systems that underpin the energy-sensitive communication within the different cellular compartments and integrate plant signaling pathways. Plants are obviously communicating with great subtlety. They need energy. Energy creates exhaust fumes. That's basically the way it works. Another lovely paper in 2024 by the same authors, the ascorbate glutathione cycle is coming of age. And inside, I'm not really showing this quite right. I might just make a really quick adjustment here. I obviously added this. Let's go back, because inside your cells, what actually happens is that glutathione is like the water in the fire truck. And every time we're generating energy in mitochondria, we spend that water, it becomes steam. The steam is oxidized glutathione. And then that oxidized glutathione is recycled by basically niacin, vitamin B3 in its various forms. There's a bit of hype going on these days about NAD, but niacin is key. And then also that required in this process is coenzyme Q. So one of the things that we've been finding in our battle to stop people getting dementia is that you get a big increase in oxidized glutathione, a reduction in reduced or fully loaded glutathione. So more steam, no water, the truck's run out of its capacity to adapt. And that seems to be key. So we've developed a very simple blood test for that, which looks at the ratio of these two. Now, all animals and plants produce vitamin C. Plants produce it from fructose. Animals produce it from glucose. It's absolutely essential. I don't believe it would have been possible to burn glucose and generate ATP without the antidote to the exhaust protection system, which is ascorbate. But we have lost that ability due to the absence of a codon on a gene. We cannot make the very last enzyme. And as a consequence, we have all sorts of problems. We've lost that ability to make vitamin C. Vitamin C is critical to deal with all that oxidation. And I learned much of this back in the 80s with Dr. Linus Pauling. What a wonderful, bright, intelligent man. When Einstein was asked, are you a genius? He said, if you want a real genius, it's Linus Pauling. Let me show you a little film a friend of mine made.
Humans, like the guinea pig, apes, bats, and some species of fish, do not generate ascorbate in their bodies. Animals which do generate their own ascorbate make a lot of it and produce even more when they are sick. An adult goat, with a weight roughly that of an adult human, makes about 13,000 milligrams daily, and when faced with life-threatening diseases or severe toxic challenges, goats can produce as much as 100,000 milligrams of vitamin C per day. Animals which don't generate their own ascorbate eat a lot of vegetables. An adult gorilla in the wild will eat a whopping 18 kilograms of vegetation, the equivalent of 4,500 milligrams of ascorbate in its food.
Oh, I'd rather a banana.
Extrapolating from the natural diet of apes, Pauling argued that for a human adult eating only vegetables to generate 2,500 kcal, an acceptable daily level of food energy would entail also consuming 2,300 milligrams of ascorbate. Consequently, he believed that the RDA set at 60 milligrams per day in the US and 40 milligrams in the UK, and based purely on the amount of vitamin C needed to avoid scurvy, was much too low.
So there's a little bit of very interesting evolutionary background. And Linus Pauling, was amazing that, you know, in the 70s, he wrote this book, Vitamin C, the Common Cold and Flu. And on it, he put, when the next flu epidemic is expected, it's important that everyone know he can protect himself to a considerable extent against the disease and its consequences by the use of this important nutrient, vitamin C. And he basically worked out that the level of vitamin C that animals produce, all animals except for those exceptions like us and guinea pigs and so on, we would have to take in about a gram, 1,000 milligrams, which technically is 20 supermarket oranges, but I assure you there are some that have no vitamin C at all, to have the same blood level of animals when exposed to a virus. So during COVID, for example, I worked with the Chinese professor, Professor Zhong Peng, in Wuhan at the Zhongnan University Hospital. And they ran a randomized controlled trial giving critical COVID patients 12 grams twice a day, so 24 grams in 24 hours. And they reduced mortality by 70%, which then got mandated. So it is the standard treatment for critical COVID. And also the Chinese government shipped in 5 tons of vitamin C into Wuhan, 5 million grams, and distributed it. And strangely, Wuhan went from, you know, tons of people dying in January to, by the end of April, they couldn't even find critical COVID patients to enter their randomized controlled trials. And that's what Linus Pauling was talking about. Let's move on to the third process, lipidation, the fats of life. So here's an extraordinary thing for, you know, so much of our evolution. Going back billions of years, we have algae. It's mainly omega-3, and you know, there's not so much going on. And then suddenly something happens that wipes out the dinosaurs, among others, around 600 million years ago. And we have this Cambrian explosion. Suddenly there are tons of plants with flowers and edible seeds. I remember asking the genius Professor Michael Crawford, who I'll introduce you to in a minute, if the ocean's full of omega-3 and all this algae and so on, why were dinosaurs and fish so stupid? He said, come on, Patrick, a mother cod lays 1 million eggs. So that cod has, you know, it's the mother's nutrition of 1 day divided by 1 million. That's all that cod has to build its brain. We didn't really get big brains until there were omega-6 rich edible flowering plants with edible seeds. Before then, the seeds of ferns were absolutely giant and inedible. And omega-6 is actually sticky and promotes blood vessels. So we had to move from reptilian evolution to mammalian reproduction. And it's that, you know, maybe instead of laying an egg, the egg started to stick. And, you know, now we have a situation with humans where you've got 9 months of nutrition feeding the brain. But in order to feed the brain, you have to have very good a vascular system. And within 2 weeks of conception, there is actually a beating heart. And that requires omega-6. So we do need omega-6 and omega-3. And the seminal work of Professor Michael Crawford back in the 70s showed that if you analyze the types of fatty acids in the organs of different animals, they vary depending on what they eat in the liver and the lung various other organs, but in the brains of every single animal, without exception, from a mouse to a hippopotamus, to a dolphin, to a human, to a rat, to a cat. There are two fatty acids that are clearly predominant. One of them is omega-3 DHA, which is a marine fat. It's not a land fat, it's a marine fat. And the other is arachidonic acid, which is an omega-6 fat, ultimately derived from plants, although you could have milk, for example, from a cow that eats grass, and it will provide you arachidonic acid. And, really, it's like the ones and zeros of computer code. You cannot have a brain without those. And it probably all started a long time ago, when maybe 400 million years ago, when a single-celled organism, probably dinoflagellate, much like an eye cell, incorporates the lipid DHA, which is very unique, docosahexaenoic acid, 6 double bonds. It is capable of turning photonic sun energy into electricity. And this little creature probably got a twitch, electric shock, basically, towards food, and hence is the beginning of the nervous system and the brain 400 million years ago. So when you look at a neuronal membrane, our brain cells, what you see is the omega-3 DHA, the omega-6 arachidonic acid. Every now and again, there's a cholesterol packer. If you rip the cholesterol out with too much statins and drive your cholesterol too low, below 4, then what happens is you start to have cognitive deficit, because you need the cholesterol. It's a nutrient. 25% of the cholesterol in your body is in the brain. It is a nutrient. Now, so the coming back to Darwin's whole approach, conditions of existence. So 6.5 million years ago, we split from chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas. Their brain size stays exactly the same, and our hominid brain size just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So the question we have to ask is, and I always ask the question, what causes that? Why? What were the conditions that required that to occur? And by the way, our brain size peaked at close to 1,700 grams. This is all done on skull size, around 30,000 years ago. And we've been shrinking ever since. So today's brain size is 1,336 grams as an average. So Homo sapiens brain size has shrunk in the last 20 or so thousand years by 20%. And it's all about the brain. Get nutrition right for your brain, you've got it right for the body. And I think we'll learn a lot about plants in the process. So a newborn baby's brain to body ratio is massive. It's all about the brain. It's not about genes. Our genes are only 1.2% different to a gorilla or a chimpanzee. It's about the change in the conditions of existence. That's the point. It had to be that. We had to be the aquatic ape, the waterside ape, who found a niche in wetlands and swamplands and rivers and the coast and the estuaries, and became upright wading in water and developed manual dexterity opening shells. And we have an insulating layer of fat, a hairless body, a nose for swimming, ear extoses, that should say. Dolphins have extoses that have actually blocked their ability to hear, but it's really good for diving, so they've developed sonar. Now, an ENT a specialist can look in your ear and go, you're a diver, because the more you dive, the more these extoses protrude. We have a diving reflex. Babies can learn to swim long before they learn to walk. And it was Sir David Attenborough who said once on TV, human babies are born with a waxy waterproof layer. The vernix, he said, I've never seen this in a land-based mammal. I wonder if it occurs in the marine mammals. And a marine biologist picked up on this. And sure enough, we have identical vernix to a seal. And it is this rich marine food, I'm talking about mussels and cockles and oysters and fish and crabs, etc., that provide the conditions of existence that would allow the brain to grow omega-3s and phospholipids and B12 and zinc and vitamin D and so on. And last year I visited the moken. These are sea nomads. They live in Indonesia. They can hold their breath for as long as a dolphin. They spend 5 hours in the sea. They're born in the sea. They're weaned on seaweed. And they're highly attuned to that environment. They actually go down and blow out some bubbles that attract a certain kind of fish who gets close. And when they're close enough, they blow out this burst of oxygen, which gets the fish completely stoned, and they can literally pick it up or spear it and have it for dinner. And they became a bit famous in the tsunami, because the day before, the night before the tsunami, their elders came to them in dreams and said, go uphill. And they packed up shop. And they packed up their village. They all left without exception, went up the hill, and not one of them died. And that got rather noticed. Now, babies are born with 50 trillion brain connections, making 1 million a minute in the first months, with the brain consuming 75% of all energy from food. You cannot do that only from glucose. You have to have ketones. And babies are born like little mini Michelin men and with lots of blubber, unlike I've just had animals on my farm born, and they're skinny and they can stand up. And breast milk is uniquely high in both sugar and fat. Where I live in South Wales, they found a 40,000-year-old complete Homo sapiens remains with all this jewelry, a bling, a necklace of shells, various shell artifacts. Assumed it was a woman for that reason, but it turned out it was actually a man. When they did the bone and DNA analysis, they found that at least 1/5 of their diet was marine food. Why go hunting when you can just pick up this food? Now, let's assume that they were expending at least double the calories that I do, collecting water and wood and foraging and so on. If so, I would have to have 40% of my diet as marine food to get the levels of omega-3, phospholipids, zinc, selenium, vitamin D, etc., B12, that occurred during that whole period of time that led to Homo sapiens. This is Michael Crawford. His book, The Shrinking Brain, is absolutely genius. He's 94, and he wanted to give you a message.
And I say that 1972, we recognized that the brain evolved in the sea. The marine food web was a determinant of the brain. And if we don't change our food system, then the brain would go. I mean, simply, we lose our brains, we lose Homo sapiens, and it's the sixth extinction, the end of humanity.
So, let's look at the fourth factor, methylation, the conductor. So from food protein methionine, we generate an incredible orchestrator of things called S-adenosylmethionine, which can turn genes on or off, epigenetics, repair DNA, make phospholipids, make neurotransmitters. I mean, if the fire alarm goes off and you're pumping adrenaline, how do you make it? You make it by methylation. Methylation depends on B vitamins and especially folate. So there are 5 methyl groups in the food, folate, and the greens that we eat. We also need B12. And if I PubMed search National Library of Sciences, methylation and plants, I find 41,000 studies. It's absolutely central. The whole process of methylation in plants and how genes are turned on and off and adapted and so on, it's critical. Now, below, when you have a homocysteine, when you're not doing methylation, you accumulate something in your blood called homocysteine. And if it's above 11, your brain is shrinking. And the average person at my age will have a homocysteine of 12. So about half of people over 60 in the States have a homocysteine level which shows accelerated brain shrinkage because of either a lack of folate, B12, B6. In essence, it's an indicator of B vitamins. I want to show you a film that explains this.
Your brain has 100 billion brain cells called neurons, making 100 trillion connections between them, communicating to each other with chemicals called neurotransmitters. Brain cell membranes are made from both phospholipids, which are abundant in eggs, which attach to the omega-3 fat DHA, abundant in oily fish. To make a brain cell membrane, they have to be bound together by a process called methylation. Methylation depends on B vitamins. If you lack B12 rich in animal foods, or B6 or folate found in whole foods and greens, your blood homocysteine level rises. Your homocysteine level predicts the rate of brain shrinkage as you age. Lowering homocysteine with B vitamins cuts shrinkage by over 70% in those with enough omega-3.
So now you start to see that there is this codependence between omega-3 and B vitamins. This is illustrated by the former head of our scientific advisory board at Oxford University, professor of pharmacology, who did a study with people with pre-dementia, mild cognitive impairment, measuring the rate of brain shrinkage over a year in those given placebo, shown in blue. So if we just look at the blue, he split them into quartiles for homocysteine. The higher was the homocysteine at the baseline, the greater was the rate of brain shrinkage. Then half of them had B12, B6, folate, relatively high dose supplementation. And what happened, particularly in those in the highest quarter for homocysteine, was 53% less brain shrinkage. And when they looked at the areas of shrinkage that are associated with Alzheimer's, and by the way, it was his research group who developed the brain scan that is used to diagnose Alzheimer's. Dementia you can diagnose with a cognitive function test, but Alzheimer's dementia, which is 2/3 of dementia, you need to do a brain scan of the medial central temporal lobe. And that's what these guys basically, their research helped to develop that globally. 9 times less shrinkage of those areas with the B vitamins that lowered homocysteine. And Professor David Smith and Professor Helga Refson, superb scientists, published a beautiful paper in 2021 showing that homocysteine is a biomarker for 100 diseases. Everything to do with circulation, everything to do with mental health, Parkinson's, motor neuron disease, bipolar, schizophrenia, epilepsy. You know, if you've got a neuronal disease, you've got to think homocysteine. Now, we get excited in science if we see an odds ratio of like 4. You know, if smokers have more risk of lung cancer, 4 times the risk. But here we see in this paper, not only a 10-fold increased risk of cognitive deficit if homocysteine is raised, but a 17-fold increased risk of cerebral small vessel disease. Homocysteine happens to be a very potent arterial toxin. And actually, homocysteine is the only thing so far proven to be causal for Alzheimer's. That is, if you increase the B vitamins, you lower the homocysteine, you stop the gray matter atrophy, you improve the clinical dementia rating, and you slow cognitive decline. This is consistent with modification of the disease process. Amyloid absolutely has not been shown to be causal. And of course, the question that no one asks, and it should be asked, is why would we produce a toxic peptide, amyloid? Why would we do that? Why would we be evolutionarily designed to do that? And that's what accumulates in the brain of some, not all, with Alzheimer's. And the answer is now clear, that it protects the brain from blood, from bleeding. Hemoglobin is so dangerous to the brain. It has iron in the middle of it. It's so oxidative. And if you look at a brain scan of anyone with dementia, you'll find at least 1,000 points of injury. So microbleeds, you may not even notice. And that bleed gets stopped, by amyloid. It stops bleeding. And also with bleeding, you get infection. And we're learning more about, herpes, and in the mouth, we have P. gingivalis. Infections that get into the brain are super dangerous. And amyloid encapsulate that's infectious agent. So we've really learned that amyloid is the fireman. It's not the fire. So you don't want to have an anti-amyloid antibody injection, which lowers amyloid. But of course, your brain starts bleeding because you've ripped the plaster off. So just to contextualize this right now, looking at the hardest evidence of randomized controlled trials, the combination of B vitamins and omega-3 reduces brain shrinkage by 68%. And the latest anti-amyloid drug licensed in America, donanemab, increased the rate of brain shrinkage by 20%, and 4 people died. 20% got brain bleeding, 24% got swelling. Some years on, 2017, the Oxford group realized we missed a trick. We didn't give omega-3. I wonder what the interaction is with omega-3. So they went back to their blood samples and split their participants in their seminal trial into those with the third lowest omega-3 in their blood, and they found the B vitamins didn't do anything, and the third highest, and they got not the average 53% shrinkage reduction, they got 73% less shrinkage of the brain, which brought the shrinkage down to the level that you find in people who don't develop dementia. And also 30% of people in their trial ended the year with a clinical dementia rating of 0. They could not be diagnosed with dementia, pre-dementia, mild cognitive impairment. I mean, this is astonishing. So don't forget your vitamins and your omega-3, and you may need to get a blood test for homocysteine. And here was a lovely paper in Holland, and they looked at thousands of people, and they found when the homocysteine was above 8, you got increased risk of dementia. When the vitamin D was below 15 nanograms per mil, 45 nanomoles, you got increased risk of dementia. And if the omega-3 index was below 5%, increased risk. And then they asked the statistical question, if one has raised homocysteine, low vitamin D, and omega-3 index, what is your risk compared to someone who doesn't? And the answer was 4.6 times the increased risk. So I've written about all this in my new book, which is really on the back of these. I stand on the shoulder of all these, wonderful geniuses who've focused on one area. And the book is out, Amazon.com. You'll find it, and it's fully referenced. And yes, Dr. Dale Bredesen, he says, superbly researched book. Patrick Holford has been a leader in the field of dementia prevention for years. It's very, very clear that this is a disease that you can prevent. And at the end of the book, I show that, for example, if you have a raised homocysteine above 11 and you lower it, you can expect to reduce your risk by 40%. If you have a low omega-3 index below 5% and you raise it to 8%, you reduce your risk by 20%. Since half the population do and half don't, then the population attributable risk of omega-3 is 10%, homocysteine 30%. Eat more fruit and veg, stop eating sugar, be active, don't drink too much alcohol, get your vitamin D up, eat eggs, get some choline. It's really not difficult to prevent this disease. The reason I'm showing you this is that from that methionine producing homocysteine, we can also go on the left-handed path whereby homocysteine, as long as you have enough of the right B vitamins, can produce glutathione, that central antioxidant. And anthocyanidins, we've got a lovely berry garden here. I love these new, blackberries that are spikeless. It's amazing. You don't have to kind of draw blood in the process of picking them, rich in anthocyanidins. And they all produce GABA, and GABA makes you relax. So there's this whole wonderful cycle. And a ketogenic diet, by the way, also promotes GABA. And it could be very useful for certain mental health conditions as well. So we've covered the 4 horsemen of the mental health apocalypse. And whenever you have a lot of oxidation, you always get increased methylation problems and raised homocysteine, and with raised homocysteine, you get oxidative problems. And what we're doing at our charity, which, by the way, I can tell you now, I couldn't have told you yesterday, but we have just received a £600,000 award from the government's Innovate UK agency to put our cognitive function testing into the National Health Service. This is so exciting. And one of the things we've developed is a home test kit, which you can buy in the States right now, and you become part of our research, and you prick your finger, got a drop for each test, and it shows you exactly where you're at, your homocysteine, HbA1c, omega-3, vitamin D, and the glutathione index, the ratio of reduced and oxidized glutathione. So we've done those 4 factors. Hydration is critical. I wish I had more time to study the work of Gerald Pollack, professor in the Department of Biology at McGill, who claims that there are not 3 states of water, ice, water, steam, but there is a 4th state in which water actually becomes a fundamental communication messenger in the membranes of cells, both in plants and humans. I would really like to have some time to study that more, because 3 years ago I went to Colombia to visit the Kogi. The Kogi are a tribe up in the Sierra Nevadas in the north of Colombia who were never discovered by the Spanish conquistadores. So they remained genetically unique. The men have no facial hair. They're quite short. They chew coca all the time. And I said, where did we go wrong? And the first answer he said is that you are taught that consciousness is only in living things. It isn't. Consciousness is in everything. It's in every water molecule, every rock, every plant, everything. So water is absolutely critical to the kogi. So our final sixth process is digestion and absorption, the microbiome. And of course, plants have roots and we have the gut, the villi. If you lay the villi surface area out flat, it's the size of it's bigger than a tennis court. And I loved the book by a friend of mine, Merlin Sheldrake, Entangled Life, How Fungi Make Our World, Change Our Minds and Shape Our Futures. Beautifully written. And of course, we see all these parallels that the gut and the root absorbs nutrients, harbors large complex groups of microbes, regulates genetic expression. It's got all these metabolic capacitors, provides nutrients, protects against pathogens, and roots go outwards, into the soil. And we have rootlets that go inwards and take those nutrients from our food into our bloodstream. So it made total sense to me when Dan said that it's the respiration of the soil that predicts nutrient density. And of course, the soil won't be breathing unless it's got a healthy microbiome, and it can't have a healthy microbiome if it hasn't got the right conditions of existence, such as minerals. So does a healthy gut microbiome predict health? We don't really know yet exactly what a healthy gut microbiome is. It looks like more diversity is good, but this is really a watch this space. We know that the microbiome of older people is different to younger people. We don't know exactly what that means and why. We know that there are certain bacteria like the lactobacilli and bifidobacteria that are resident and seem to be really good for so many things. There are non-resident bacteria that we use, for example, to make yogurt like streptococcus, which are good and generate lactic acid, but they're not quite as potent as the good guys. And we know there are bad guys. And we know we've got 100 trillion bacteria weighing 2 kilograms of usually about 130 different types. So this is a whole new frontier for sure. We know that vitamin C actually promotes healthy gut bacteria. There are 2 good studies showing 1 gram to 3 grams a day will actually promote more bifidobacteria. So just to wrap up so we can have a good time for questions, for those who are interested in this exploration, there are 3 books that I think may be of interest to you. A couple of years ago, I wrote The Hybrid Diet. It was actually a challenge to a friend of mine who's an award-winning medical journalist and represented the sort of keto community, the very low-carb, high-fat. And I'm more a low GL, low glycemic load. So I say less carbohydrates, but good ones, always fiber first. And it was sort of like a duel to see which works better. And we learned, that we are hybrid. We can run on either glucose or ketones, which has some tremendous advantages. And actually, it's quite good to switch. So interesting book. Last year, I wrote Upgrade Your Brain, which is probably a tremendously good place to start. And it covers children's mental health and, every aspect of how the brain works. And then just recently, Alzheimer's Prevention as a Cure. So foodforthebrain.org is the charity. The books are all available at Amazon all around the world. So, that's how you can go a bit deeper. But most of all, what I would really love for your purpose and also to help research and to help everyone is go to foodforthebrain.org, which is a not-for-profit charity, and do for free the validated cognitive function test, which is not a questionnaire, which will work out where your cognition is at right now. So you've got your baseline. Then you fill in a questionnaire, which assesses your health and your resilience across 8 domains. And we've spoken about low carbs, brain fats, B vitamins, antioxidants, healthy gut, not active body, active mind, sleep and calm yet. And it will then work out your future risk and then tell you exactly what you need to do to change it. And this is something called cognition. And we've run hundreds of thousands, 450,000 tests in total. And what we know is that cognitive function is decreasing relatively linearly on average from the age of 18. So a 30-year-old does worse than a 25-year-old who does worse than a 20-year-old. But it's only in that last phase that we start to get concerned. But actually, that cognitive function is decreasing. But in those people who are doing the right things, are in the top quarter of dementia risk index. If you're doing everything wrong, you'd have a dementia risk index of 100%. If you're doing everything right, it would be 0%. So these are the 25% or less. They, if you continue the line, are predicted to develop dementia when they're about 150. So we can dementia proof. And this is what we're doing around the world. And I'm just going to end with a very quick example of a woman called Dorothy, who kept finding her husband called Nodge in different rooms at night. He couldn't find a bathroom in his own house. He couldn't turn his computer on or off. He was a computer programmer. He was an avid gardener. He couldn't plant a spring garden. He couldn't even really conceive of tomorrow. He couldn't eat and talk at the same time. Anyway, obviously they went to the doctor and then the memory clinic, and he was diagnosed with mixed dementia, which is vascular and Alzheimer's. But to be honest, all dementia is vascular, always. And, you know, what do I do? They said, nothing. So they found our charity, foodforthebrain.org, did the test online, which is free, found out that they were a bit low in omegas and B vitamins, increased them, cut out sugar, went ketogenic 5 days a week, took C8 oil, 2 tablespoons a day, and then got active, joined a Morris dancing group. This is a lot of physical and social interaction. And basically doubled his cognitive function as measured on the test that defines it, and reduced his dementia risk index to, you know, from 56% to 37%. And Dorothy says, I've got my husband back from dementia. So I'd love you to do this, not only for your own brain, but tell everyone to do this, because this is a preventable disease. It really is. And all the risk factors are the same for all diseases, and they're fundamental to how we understand plants, foodforthebrain.org. And a few months ago, we introduced the same thing for children. So we have a similar test for children and their parents and teenagers. It's really great, smart kids, because the children, they are our future. And we started a campaign a few months ago called Neurodivergence. Don't just normalize it, optimize it. And I'll just show you very quickly a story of BBC, who invited me into a school of kids aged 7 to 8. And I asked the school teacher how many of these kids are having problems reading, writing, behaving. And she said about 30%. The BBC had said, can you change a child's learning and behavior in a week? And I said, it's worth a shot. The worst child in the school was Reese. And the day before we started, all children had to write an essay. And then we encourage the parents, less sugar, more omegas, more vitamin D, more fish, less meat, more fruit, more veg, more nuts, more seeds, no chemical additives. And what you're seeing here is the change in his handwriting in 1 week. He went up a year in reading and writing age in 1 month, just by changing the conditions of existence. Everything we do at our charity is supported by friends who pay $60 a year and get, so many benefits for it, much like your wonderful Bionutrient Food Association and Bionutrient Institute, completely charitable, not for profit. We may grow more slowly as a consequence, but we keep clean. We keep clean of vested interests that seem to mess things up through the process of greed. So please join us, become a citizen scientist, support what we're doing. And together we can learn how to have healthy brains, healthy soil, healthy food, and then how to educate and motivate people to eat food because it is good for them. The benefits are direct. Thank you very much.
Well, completely brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm not sure everyone followed all the nuances of all the science, but I think the basic points were very, very clear. Yes, your work is.
I wanted to stimulate a discussion, just throw some ideas.
What's that?
I just want to throw some ideas in there, stimulate discussion. change the way we see things. And of course,
Yeah.
you've got the slides. So if you want to look up any of the science, you've got
Exactly. No, and all the citations are there. Yeah, brilliant, brilliant. Boy, I have got so many places to go. We've got 45 minutes for the Q&A section. So people, please start putting questions in the Q&A for Patrick. I see a couple starting to come in. I'll run through a few of my thoughts here, but we'll try to integrate it all. I think one of the things you said right at the end actually was the root causes for all disease is the same. Did I get that line? Did you say something?
Yes. The very same things we're looking at are driving all diseases. And actually, if you keep asking the question, what causes that? What causes that? You generally will get down to two things only, and that is ignorance and addiction. If you say sugar is bad, say, well, yeah, but why do we eat sugar? And it's either ignorance or it's addiction, and usually a bit of both.
Yeah.
And that's really what we're dealing with, ignorance and addiction.
I was hoping to go to a little more biochemical solution set, but I think
well, I think sugar is such a big problem,
Yeah.
And the marketers have learned how to get us addicted.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the synthetic flavoring agents, etc.
You're doing what we're doing, which is, we give people food and they go, wow, I've never tasted a salad like that. I mean, that is amazing.
And I feel better.
Yeah. And, you were the one who said that, it's really your taste. Your whole system is actually designed in a sense to taste nutrients. And funny enough, we got a guy who might be starting to work here, and he was involved in an experiment, based on your stuff, where they were basically 8 different foods from different organic growers and this grower and whatever. And they rated it, according to taste. And then they did a refractometer process. And basically it agreed with their subjective assessments of what tastes really good.
Yeah. Well, the refractometer thing is actually a topic we're going to be presenting next week. Is our upcoming session on the Brexit campaign, where we're hoping to do something remarkably similar to what you've done here with your food for the brain kit. It's in that vein of citizen science and supporting people in taking Brix readings from their local supply chain, uploading that into the onto an app basically, so that we can each know which store and which brand generally has better or worse, to make those decisions. But
I mean, that is absolute genius, and that's the way we have to go. But then we also have to connect the pain with the gain. So it's not just, am I buying a carrot that's got more beta carotene or whatever? It's well, what does that do for me? That's the sort of thing.
Yeah, well, I mean,
people are suffering. They're suffering. They're scared of getting cancer and dementia, and they're feeling tired, and their body's aching. So we have to make that connection. And I'll tell you a funny story, because years ago I was invited by the British Summer Fruit Association, who wants to increase berry sales.
Yeah.
And not strictly accurate, but strawberries have a lot of zinc in their seeds. So I wrote a piece for them, a press release: strawberry yields forever, berry horny. Zinc is important. Everything that grows is zinc. It's sex. Really, you need zinc for everything. And it went all over the world. It was in Pravda, it was in the China Times, it was in the India Times, and berry sales in the UK went up by 25% and never recovered.
Never recovered. They've been higher ever since. Yeah, they haven't dropped back down again.
No. So, kale and cruciferous veg, and they're so powerful, anti-cancer in the liver. And, we have to make these connections. But then, of course, the critical issue is, can you, go into the supermarket with your smartphone and go, this kale has the punch, basically.
Well, that's a whole nother level of it. But I think what you're saying about the marketing and the way of framing and storytelling, which is something that I've always found in you, is just a sort of like a sixth gear. Your brain functions in some kind of way where you can, make these connections and convert it into stories. How many books have you written? I mean, just on the record, like,
well, over 40. Yeah.
Over 40. I've forgotten how many. He says
30 languages. It's fascinating. I mean, yesterday, the China, a major publisher, just bought the rights for the Alzheimer's book. They got 300 million over 60. And they're starting to get into a sort of regenerative organic type thing. They're a bit behind, largely speaking, on nutrition. The Japanese are, were quite a long way ahead. So I think there are real opportunities for what you're doing in China, and we should maybe explore that.
We should talk about that, but I was hoping maybe you could just share what you've been doing in China, because as I understand it, I mean, the basic textbook, I mean, the government took this and published millions and millions of copies. And
I was very lucky. About maybe 10 years ago, a wonderful professor, Fan from Beijing University, translated my book, Op Nutrition Bible, which is starting a bit of a revolution out there. And one day I got a call from a company, and they said, we want you to be our ambassador for nutrition. They have a company, they've got 16 million customers over 60, and they support older people. 16 million over 60, that's quite nice, And they paid to translate our cognitive function tests and everything into Chinese. We then had a conference and formed a group with the former Minister of Health, the former Vice Minister of Health, the President of the China Health Association. And we had some slogans like, what we need is education, not medication. And based on the science, it's not the same block that we seem to have in the West. They said we need food, supplements, and lifestyle. Because the point is, things like B12, we can't really eat. I mean, a lot of older people don't absorb B12. I mean, there's a whole reason for that to do with stomach acid and all the rest of it. But I mean, my wife and I both, when we learned how to measure homocysteine on a pinprick of blood accurately, which is quite a breakthrough 2 years ago, my wife and I, she's younger than me, we eat the same food. We had our homocysteine tested. Mine was 7, which is optimal. Hers was 15, which is definitely brain shrinkage. And she learned I supplement 10 micrograms of B12, which is only 5 times more than the RDA. That's the ridiculous dietary arbitrary of 2 micrograms. She has to supplement 500 micrograms, and within a few weeks, her homocysteine was normal. So she's a malabsorber of B12, as are so many older people. You can't see it. You wouldn't know. It's not just about food. So I think one of the sort of issues that I've been totally, supported Friends of the Earth since the very beginning, is the idea that, become so married to growing that you have an assumption that, number one, you can get everything from plants. And number 2, you can get all the nutrients you need from the food that you eat. And that isn't really supported by the science for some very interesting reasons, like the vitamin C story, for example.
Yep.
So I'm totally into food. I want to get all the nutrients I possibly can from food. So my passion, like yours, is how do we optimize the nutrients in food first? But that doesn't mean, that there may not be a role for supplements. And we've already shown that things like B12 supplementation, relatively high dose, can really make a difference to Alzheimer's. We know that vitamin C, whenever I get any cold or flu or any sniffle, I'm on 1 gram an hour of vitamin C. COVID, I had twice, took me 18 hours. I'm 67 and I've never taken a day off work as a function of cold or flu or COVID.
I do like, there's 5 channels of response. I want to take you down for every one of the points you make here. But I'll only just stay to a couple central ones. Standing back, nutrition, orthomolecular nutrition, I think it was you said it was started as, Linus Pauling, nutritionists. I mean, you've been around and like from kind of the beginning of this whole science. Can you walk us through historically? Linus Pauling, right? Literally your mentor. That's ridiculous. But just walk us through what the understandings have been. You made a comment about ridiculous daily, whatever it was. But what is understood? Where are the blind spots? How is it evolving? What are the next levels?
Yeah. Well, I started in the 70s and then into the 80s, where we were actually discovering things like zinc. It was Dr. Carl Pfeiffer. He had a schizophrenic patient called Lisa, and her parents knew that she stopped being crazy if they gave her an oyster a day, but they had no idea why. And he identified zinc. And then we found selenium, and then the concept of antioxidants was born, and then through Michael Crawford's work and others, omega-3. So the point was, a very exciting phase in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and of course before that with some of the B vitamins, of actually discovering new things. That was the point. And the concept always was, you've got a disease like scurvy and you need enough vitamin C. But what I realized, I mean, it took me a while to realize that, is that Linus Pauling, I mean, he I'll give you a couple of examples. Like, ether makes you unconscious. How? Nobody knew. He sat down, worked out chemistry of unconsciousness. Modern anesthetics are born. He narrowly missed getting the Nobel Prize for DNA. There's a whole story. He was grounded because of his peace activism. He got a Nobel Prize for peace, and he guessed a triple helix, fractionally wrong. He then worked out how gene causes disease. So that was, his first work. And he then worked out epigenetics, how the environment affects genetic expression. And then it was Dr. Abraham Hoffer, I believe, who switched him on to vitamin C. And what he noticed, he just stepped back and he said, all animals make it except for us and very few others. That's why the guinea pig is the experimental animal of choice. And the ones who make it have very little cancer and very little heart disease, and they're very resilient to virus. I mean, when have you seen a goat with a cold, for example? And, cats they found recently got the same variant of COVID as their owners, but they didn't die. So, they still get exposed to viruses. They make more vitamin C. So I remember when I first met him, he said, am I more like a rat who makes human equivalent 3 grams a day, or a goat that makes 13 grams a day? And I think he was sort of in his late 80s, heading to 90. He went for 6 grams. So his logic was very simple. Animals who make it have very few disease, make lots of vitamin C. We don't. And I think probably what happened, I mean, we obviously don't know the full story, but a little bit of radiation zaps some, early primate ancestor of ours, loses the ability to make vitamin C, tremendous disadvantage, but can still eat it because they're living in a tropical fruit-rich environment, so they don't die. And as you saw with the goat, a ton of energy is used to make vitamin C from glucose. So what would be the consequence? More energy. So they probably became top shagger, and consequently we are, we are descendants of that. And it may have helped us because we have more energy, but it's also not helped us because we can't make vitamin C. So, that was a real twist and a turn. And, he spent his last 37 years on immaculate science on vitamin C. And still people sort of, I remember giving a lecture and someone said, he was a fraud. He was, he was a quack. He was a crank, And I said, you want me to say to this audience that Linus Pauling was a crank? And he said, yes. All right. And I said, Linus Pauling was a crank. And you know what a crank is? It's a small, efficient tool designed for generating revolutions. Now, do you mind sitting down? I'm giving the talk, not you. That was fun. But, these big thinkers, who take things a little bit further, and still we haven't really materialized the results of his work, primarily because of greed. That's really what stops all of this. Any nutrient that has the capacity to make a very big difference and wipe out a whole lot of pharmaceutical drugs. And that's the big problem we have. And I'm sure we have it in farming as well. Post World War II, we go into, agrochemicals, we go into pharmaceuticals,
Yep.
into food chemicals. And it's just tragic that we see this decline in humanity as a function of greed. So to a large extent, I think we know a lot now already about nutrition. We probably know enough. And really, it's like Marcel Proust said, the real act of discovery is not in finding new lands, but in seeing with new eyes. We just need to look at what we know in a different way and be bold with it and apply it. And what I've learned is that when you give someone the right nutrients, and I'm sure, if you give nature the right conditions and you support it, you get paid back 100-fold. And the only significant problem I think that we face when we get the nutrition right is, what do you do with all that extra energy?
You're 67, like you keep saying, and you go skydiving.
Yeah, I'm just graduating as a paraglider pilot.
Paragliding,
Yeah.
sorry, paragliding.
Very good. I mean, that's an interesting point, because basically to build muscle, you have to exercise. If you don't exercise, your muscles atrophy. And to build a brain, you've got to exercise. So we need to stimulate the brain. We need to be learning all the time.
Yeah.
And that's why, well, it's not, I just want to fly like an eagle, but my wife Gabby has bought me a bass and an amp. So once I've done the paragliding, I'm going to learn a musical instrument, which is very, very good for your brain. So yes, I said, I said, I'm 67, but I identify as young.
Yeah. Well, I mean, gosh, so what you're doing with this wisdom and bringing forth with this blood test, which is, uber simple, which anybody can do, which can, assess your system, identify deficiencies and imbalances to facilitate recommendations that can rebalance. I mean, effectively, that's what we're talking about with soil and soil tests and saying, look, there's, in many cases, underlying imbalances. Let's understand them, assess them, address them. And when you get back into balance, life takes over. But I mean, it's congratulations on the NHS. I know you've been working on this for a couple of years. We've been talking about it. But I mean, what you've done, what you've built is a way of taking forth these essential insights that have come from nutritional science, right? As you just said, effectively, we know enough already. It's just about implementing it. And what you've got with this citizen science, test kit is a powerful way of empowering people. But also, I mean, as I understand it, you're collecting all this metadata, and we're able to find patterns. And I mean, you're doing it all open source. I mean, the parallels with our work are extremely
Exactly.
similar.
And what we say to the individual, you might say, to the grower is, we will analyze you and give you your results, but the data is all anonymized.
Yeah.
The deal is we will not run, this blood test or anything else unless you agree that we can use the anonymized data in our research database, which is completely charitable. So sometimes people say, could you tell me, what my results are? And I said, well, actually, I can't. Only you know what they are. If you tell me what your results are, I can help you. And so I think that's very important. And in China, we have the potential next year to test 80 million people. Now, the biggest database in America is NHANES, under 100,000. In the UK is 500,000. We've already run 450,000 tests. So now we get data. So the most valuable thing you have actually is data, is all this data. And then people will want to come and look at that data and, do their own studies. So the data is important. And it's the end of the randomized controlled trial era, really, when you have big data. And then also, you don't need the priest, you don't need the church, you don't need, to be trying to change the healthcare system and all doctors. You go straight to people, and that's what you do. And I think that's the age we're in. We need to do it boldly, and of course, we can connect the whole soil and the plant and the food, and the health and the brain. It's a win-win. Very exciting times. We're on the edge of a paradigm shift, truly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I just, the way you're structuring the data, I feel very affirmed in our strategic structural, work with definition, nutrient density, et cetera. Hearing you do exactly this with human health and nutrition and testing and recommending of materials to address deficiencies. It's extremely similar how we're envisioning doing it. There's something about this model I think is like you said, the end of the randomized controlled trial. That's what it comes down to. Enough metadata, and you can find much more nuanced patterns.
Well, I'm actually just making a film on this because basically you have the randomized control trial. I've been told that the latest one on the anti-amyloid drug was about $250 million. There's only one industry who can play that game. Then you have lots of randomized control trials to make the meta-analysis. And who's interpreting that? Well, lovely professors who ultimately their department is funded by this, that, or the other. And then they're going to come up with a result. And I just looked at the one from China, the US and the UK, and they completely disagree. The UK ignored homocysteine completely. The NIH study said it's 22% of all risk. The Chinese said it was the single most promising treatment for Alzheimer's. And so they disagree. It's meant to be the gold standard, the meta-analysis. And then the purpose of that is then to advise your governments to, who don't listen at all, to then make changes in the system, which doesn't happen. So it's just basically a waste of money. And now, we have this ability to collect data, in millions, billions, and really, AI is, people are very scared of it, and for many reasons, but it does provide us with the ability to look for the 5-star brainers, look for, the processes, look for what works, and then share it back. And I think that's, that's a real win, because at the end of the day, the critical point, which will probably turn everything really, is that people are suffering. They're going to get interested in food because they're suffering. So we have to connect, the pain with the gain. And and what you're doing, what we're doing, they can't work separately. We have to work together.
But the foundational framing about causal factors and what's driving, what will drive change is exactly, again, to that very point, as things get more difficult, our incentives become stronger and stronger to shift. Yeah, brilliant. I'm just going to do one last point. I wanted you to sort of re-emphasize before I go to the questions from the participants. The whole thing with aquatic evolution and marine foods. I mean, this is, you and I have gone back and forth on a few things. I push hard and you're like, no, this is the deal, kid. But I think that's a really important thing. And we talk about omega-3s and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, there's something really important there. And
I'm very
do you
glad
want to re-emphasize that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you it through the story of Professor Michael Crawford, who was invited to Japan and went on mainstream telly, lecturing in most of the top universities, and eventually was invited into the government ministry. And, the health minister said, please tell us this again. And he said it again, and he wasn't sure if the guy was listening. It was very, very quiet. And at the end, he said, we have to agriculturalize the ocean. So what we're going to do, which they've done in Japan, is between certain islands, they have stopped all trawling. They have planted seagrasses and seaweeds. They studied the keystone species they wanted to bring back, like there's one fish that likes tubes. They created artificial reefs. And in a very, very small amount of time, just literally a few years, they regenerated the whole marine food web. Commercially, they had much more fish and, aquatic produce. So they're in, the idea of sticking salmon in a cage, in a confined area, in overcrowding, and then having to give them antibiotics because they're sick is like insane. In the UK, in the Great British Isles, we got 100,000 miles of exploitable coast, but exploitable by changing the conditions of existence, which then bring back life. So you don't have to bring back life, you just have to change the conditions of existence, which of course is a total parallel with what you're doing. And that regenerating marine agriculture is just as important as regenerating, soil and land agriculture. And the fact that our brains have these two fatty acids, a land-based omega-6 and a sea-based, or water-based omega-3, it's fascinating. And I don't think we've really put those two pieces together quite right.
It's such a massive piece of the puzzle. Like you said, we always think about the land, we don't think about the oceans, but I mean, they're massive parts of the of the planet. And yeah, I know people here on the East Coast of the US that are doing that, sort of putting, working actively to bring back kelp forests and all that. It's so powerful. It's so powerful. And the vitality and fecundity that comes from that and that can be cycled through, just absolutely massive. Yeah. But I think the point I was going towards was the critical import from your perspective of marine-based foods as a significant part of our diets, full stop. And, I sort of argue with you about how much omega-3 you can have in an egg and how much you can have in beef. And if the animals are raised well, and you come with all the different types of omega-3s and 6s and how they all, one creates the next, and what's in a fish from the ocean is different than what's in a steak. And yeah. Anyway,
We need it. And that omega-3 index, the blood test, actually shows you how much volume of brain you got. I mean, there's a simple thing you might know. The science on it is very good. And, as a women's brain shrink in pregnancy, it's sort of almost now accepted as a generalization. And, there's baby brain, many have experienced that.
yeah,
Why? And the simple reason is that the fetus is evolutionarily designed to need those nutrients. It will rob the mother's brain. Mummy, I shrank your brain, but it probably doesn't need to. So
it doesn't need to, is the
doesn't
key
need
point.
to. You have enough omega-3, enough phospholipids, which may be more than seem socially acceptable now. But, if you go back to that 40,000-year-old Homo sapiens, New York was an oyster bed. I mean, in the 1800s, the estimated consumption of oysters every day in New York was 1 million. So it's like if we were having this conversation, in the early 1800s, that's what people ate. Normal.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah. No,
Come abnormal. Yeah.
and yeah, it's a stepping back, seeing the perspective, seeing the connections, implications. I love how you're weaving so much in here. I'm gonna turn to the questions from the attendees, just to make sure we cover those. Katrina says, "Love this. This resonates with so many people." I think that's true. Mindy asks, "Please, would you share the slides?" I'm assuming you'd be okay if we put the slides out as part of the recording.
I've sent you the PDF so you can have them all. No problem.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Um,
And I would say one thing that, obviously some of the slides have references on them and so on, but, if you really want to get into the science, all of my books are fully referenced, and not in that annoying way. I don't know why this is done, where you read a chapter and there's no numbers, and at the end of the chapter, there's a list where it has studies, and you go, how do I know what that says to that? So in mine, you have the little number, and we don't put the references in the book. We have them online. So you can then go to the references online. You can click on the number. You can go straight to the study, and in most cases, you can see it.
yeah.
So if you go, I'm interested, I want more science, Upgrade Your Brain, Alzheimer's book, they will have it, I've just scraped the surface with a few illustrative studies, really.
Yeah. And just to follow back the study you've built so far, the test you've built so far, and its specific focus on the brain. And your comment as well earlier that all these diseases are intimately interrelated. Do you have any projections, predictions, presumptions about how balancing those nutrients that you're focusing on with food for the brain will have systemic effect on a suite of other diseases?
Well, I think the first thing is our USP is the brain. It's as simple as that. It's not brawn, it's the brain. There's still too much focus on protein, and body mass. It's not body mass, size, height, strength. It's the brain. That is how Homo sapiens became the most dominant species. It is the brain. And where I've got to is if you get nutrition right for the brain, you've got it right for the body. So it's as simple as that. If you just focused on brain nutrition, optimum brain nutrition, you know what it's like. The reason I've been focusing for the last decade really on Alzheimer's is not because I have a particular interest in that. It's because I knew that we had to do prevention. And I knew that no one's interested in prevention until they get diabetes, until they get heart disease, until they get cancer. Then they're interested. So I predicted 10 years ago that Alzheimer's would become the single biggest killer. It is number one killer, actual number one killer, has been here since 2022, number one healthcare cost by a long way. And it's become the number one fear, bigger than gaining weight, actually. So I figured if we're going to, and also most importantly, while you can reverse type 2 diabetes, you can't really reverse Alzheimer's. I mean, once you've got holes in your brain, you're not getting them back anytime soon. Maybe we can make a bit of difference, but so not reversible, but is preventable. And I figured if we're gonna put an arrow into prevention, let's make that arrow Alzheimer's. And it's starting to really bear fruit because everything we say for Alzheimer's, we could even change the title to diabetes, heart disease, cancer, arthritis, whatever you wish. It's all driven by the same stuff. I mean, it's what I love about fundamental truths is, new discoveries. They make things simpler. If it's making things much more complicated, then it's not quite right. Your principles are so astonishingly, remarkably, annoyingly, and challengingly simple and true, you know.
And they seem to bear out in all circumstances. And that's what you're saying here. And so the answer to that question is yes, this is a test that would be applicable for these other
Yeah,
things.
I don't think you can, if
But-
you've got your homocysteine down, your omega-3 is good, your glutathione is good, your HbA1c is good, your vitamin D is good, I don't think you can really get sick. I mean, I tell you, Abram Hoffer, I mean, Linus Pauling, I filmed him just before he died in his mid-90s, sharp as a razor. He actually died of prostate cancer, and we had I wish the obituaries would say what people died of. Don't you always think, I wonder what they died of?
Yeah.
And we had a row about milk, actually, because milk is quite strongly linked to prostate cancer. And I've always said, I'm 67, I'm still breastfeeding from another species of animal. Do you think I'm weird? Name me a mammal that consumes milk as an adult. So, you know, excess milk makes things grow. It's its function. Nothing wrong with milk. You know, it's designed to make things grow. And if you've got prostate cancer cells, they will, breast cancer cells, they will grow faster. It's as simple as that. And then Abram Hoffer, now he took, in his mid-90s, he stopped seeing patients 2 weeks before his death. 4 days before his death, he said, I'm not feeling very well. 2 days before his death, he checked into the local hospital. They couldn't find any disease as such. And in the last 48 hours, his organs just started to pack up. He had no drugs, no pain, 2 weeks off work, fully alert. So we have forgotten that it is possible to die healthy. And you might lose your hair and you might, you know, your muscles might not be quite so functional, but you don't need to lose your mind. And not being able to remember your own children and your grandchildren and lose all your memories, I think that's a tragedy. So that's why I focused on that. But really, it's the same thing, prevention. And we've got to connect, you know, our health with our food. Nutrition has to be top of the agenda, not some afterthought.
Brilliant. And in point of fact, the NHS, the National Health Service of England, which is always being talked about as going bankrupt, has, you know, because there's way too much, you know, business, the more business that they can handle effectively, has taken this on and, you know, is planning on scaling this up. And this is the central cost.
They've taken on cognitive function testing to have an earlier diagnosis of those at risk.
Okay.
And then the question is, what do you do? Because you see the pharmaceutical industry, they also want early diagnosis of people at risk. And I fear we're heading to the two-step dance. You got high cholesterol. You need statins. You got high amyloid. You need this drug. Unfortunately, they don't have a drug. So that's, you know, everybody now wants to talk about prevention, which pharmaceutical industry means early drugs.
Yeah.
What do you mean by prevention? And so not necessarily bought in, you know, into the whole prevention package that we're offering, but certainly bought into the fact that we do have a validated cognitive function test, which at least starts the conversation, you know?
Yeah.
A bit like your measurement, it starts the conversation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's being respected, integrated, and yeah, of course, we have that last hurdle to get over. But brilliant. Yeah. Sue says, can you give Dan a suitcase of tests to bring to Kenya next month? We'd be cool to see the data here. I'm in North America.
By the way, if you're in Kenya, we're going to do it in Kenya. You probably know Healthy You, the chain of health food stores. So we hope in the new year they will have this test, so you can go into a health food store, get the test, and, you know, get on with it. So yes,
there we have it.
Like it sawa.
We've got a number of participants here from Kenya. I think they probably appreciated what you just said. It was lost on me. Let me see. Asante Sana, Sue says.
All is good. All is good, basically.
All is good. Katrina asks, is there one or two foods which you could easily add to the diet to improve many areas? What would they be? What would it be?
Well, we've obviously covered the fish, you know, smash it, salmon, mackerel, anchovies, sardines, herrings.
Slow down, smash. Say it again.
Salmon, mackerel, anchovies, sardines, herrings. That's smash it. So that's good. I would say, you know, like red, blue things, blueberries, etc. But I'm also aware that you've measured some blueberries which don't really add up. But I would say berries, and the red, blue berries. I would definitely go for cruciferous veg. Very, very big on broccoli, kale, cabbage, Brussels sprouts. That
Yeah.
whole family are fantastic. Glucosinolates help the liver to detoxify. They're very anti-cancer. So, and one of my, not just what food, but I say half of your plate for every meal has to be, vegetables, salad, cooked or not. 1/4 carbohydrate. I mean, if you're working hard in the garden, you might need more than that in terms of potatoes, but 1/4 protein. But always just be thinking, not half a plate is like 2 servings. So if I've done 2 main meals, that's 4. And I'm having some berries, that's 5, and maybe something with my breakfast, 6, and a snack like some carrots and hummus or whatever. So I'm sort of moving towards 7, but half of my plate, is living vegetable matter in one form or another. So I think that's important. Nuts and seeds actually predict health the most of all the foods. High nut seed eaters have, more health. Sugar, just literally sort of treat it like the devil. Look at that packet. I haven't developed this fully, but it's worth a thought. You look at the, 5 grams per 100 grams, 5 grams like a teaspoon. You don't want more than that. So you're actually reading the sugar, but then you get the fiber. And the idea is never eat a food where there's less fiber than sugar on the label. So I think that would be another very good thing. Fiber first. Everything you eat has fiber, whether it's beans or nuts or seeds or lentils or greens or whatever it is. Fiber is critical because that will slow down the carbohydrates.
And the thing you said about fiber, about don't drink your orange, eat it, and juicing and all processed products, right? I mean, if you just take the thing that nature made,
yeah,
and eat that.
we had a bumper crop of apples this year. I found an apple tree called Pendragon, which has the most salvestrols, which are anti-cancer. And what do we do with all these apples? We've dried them and just made some juice, and it is absolutely delicious and quite sweet, and quite cloudy. And I am aware that I'm breaking my own rule. So maybe that's another thing, sort of 80-20, have a day off, do.
Well, an apple sauce is great.
Yeah.
You can cook down a whole pot of apples really quick and make apple sauce, which keeps the fiber and the sugars and is shelf stable.
Everybody, taking the skin off plants all the time, I want them a little dirty. There's good stuff in good dirt,
You don't need to take the skin out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me see. Doug says, can you speak a bit to the best natural sources of vitamins, such as vitamin C or the various Bs? Does it make a difference where it's derived from? Which also goes to the point about synthetic versus naturally occurring. And another one of these debates you and I have had where I've been like, natural vitamins in natural sources. You're like, actually, dude, some synthesized vitamin C.
So all animals,
flesh out this.
All animals and all plants synthesize ascorbic acid. It's a relatively simple molecule, very, not far away from glucose. They synthesize ascorbic acid. That's what all plants and all animals know, ascorbic acid. And when it is synthesized in a lab, they effectively just mimic the process. They take a sugar, glucose or fructose, they put it through 5 chemical changes, and they end up with ascorbic acid. It's white, it's a powder, it's relatively stable, it's definitely synthetic, it's synthesized, but it just mimics the process. And yeah, I can say if I eat rose hips, I've got, lovely, I've got lots of vitamin C, but I got to have at least 5 times, 5 grams of rose hips to get even close to a gram of vitamin C. So, I mean, I advise some supplement companies. So I take ascorbic acid, I take berry extracts as well, concentrated. So I think it's a weird thing in herbal medicine. You take a plant that's high in something and you concentrate it and you make the tincture until it tastes utterly disgusting and is way more than you would ever eat. That's kind of how it works. And then
that's the point of a medicine is concentration of those important compounds.
And then you take it and you go, very good. And then someone says, take a vitamin C supplement, way more than you would eat. And I go, it's synthetic. So, of course, we do know that natural vitamin E, DL-alpha tocopherol, is better than the synthetic version. So, you would get as close as you possibly can. there's so much hype in this business, you know, everyone's saying this form of magnesium or that form of magnesium or this, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But they all work. I mean, I remember meeting the genius professor Burton Altura in New York for dinner, and I said, well, I prefer to give this form of magnesium, but I always give 300 milligrams of magnesium. He said, look, I study magnesium going in and out of muscle cells, you know, in real time at NIH lab and so on. Doesn't matter. I mean, yeah, there might be, this one might be slightly better. And then, like right now, everyone's gone nuts about methylfolate, and that folic acid is the devil, which is a very cheap, stable form of folate. And yes, there are some people who have a genetic polymorphism who can't deal with folic acid, but all the studies I've shown you are folic acid, you know, and they've worked. And so why everyone's gone nuts about methylfolate, which I like, is good, but Merck and Roche have developed a process which they've patented to have stable methylfolate, which is not very stable in plants. So, you know, it's relatively unstable. They've got a stable version. They've patented the process. It costs quite a lot more, and they're spreading the word that everyone must stop having any folic acid. But we do know that folic acid in pregnancy does dramatically decrease the risk not only of neural tube defects, but also autism, actually. So, but it's cheap and it's synthetic. So just, you know, just sort of explore the territory. But I think what's very important, rather than thinking, well, there's a couple of really cool concepts, some of which you might not have thought of, but we think of nutrients and then we think of anti-nutrients. It was Professor Derek Bryce Smith who said an anti-nutrient is something that promotes the excretion of a nutrient or prevents its absorption or interferes with its metabolism. So we've got both nutrients and anti-nutrients. But I say adaptogens, things that help you to adapt, and anti-adaptogens, things that interfere with that. But I was introduced recently to a very interesting concept called trace toxins by Professor Jonathan Stone from Australia. And he said a lot of these compounds that we love, like our curcumin, turmeric, and pycnogenol from pine and salvestrols, you know, actually they're toxins that plants produce to protect themselves. He said, you look under a pine tree and there's nothing growing. So the toxin that pine trees produce makes sure that they get all the nutrients and no one else. So plants produce toxins. So when we say the Mediterranean diet is good, and then you ask the question, what causes that? Why is it good? You might say, well, it's got more omega-3 or more fiber or more this, or it's got less sugar, it's got less this, you know, nutrients, anti-nutrients. But actually there are ingredients like in olives, for example, oleocanthal and various other things, which are effectively toxins. And they're good for us. So that's an interesting concept. And behind that somewhat is that what we're learning, I mean, like exercise raises your blood pressure. High blood pressure is bad. So exercise, why do we exercise? And the answer is after raising your blood pressure, you then recover. When you go in a sauna and then you jump in the cold water, when you fast and then you eat, or you expose yourself to these plant toxins, you actually build resilience. So that's an interesting new concept. Nutrients, anti-nutrients, and toxins that somehow stimulate a reaction. And that reaction builds resilience. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So there's a whole territory there that's emerging in nutrition.
Yeah. Well, I think I might have a different analysis on that one, but I'm not sure we have time to go into it. But that was a wonderful rollicking response to that question. We've only got 3 minutes left. I'm not sure if there's any final, insights or comments or commentary you'd like to leave us with. I can just as usual,
really,
far too many questions left.
There's this whole rich community of people who are into farming, organic, regenerative, loving nature and the soil and whole foods and all that stuff, kind of like us hippies, And then there's this whole world of, nutrition, and people are passionate about that and functional medicine and orthomolecular medicine and so on. And we're just remarkably siloed. And I think it's so important to, bring these communities together so that nutrition also means food, also means soil, also means how you grow things.
Yeah.
I think the real landmark will be this ability to measure and
Yeah.
show in a way that actually means something. So that's my hope and dream, that, you know, somehow these conferences and retreats and get-togethers and thingies, we start to just, you know, connect these dots. And I think it's going to be nourishing. I will learn much more about human nutrition as a result of learning about plant nutrition, and, you know, and vice versa.
Yeah, well, I think that is the opportunity, as you said earlier. You know, I can't remember who you were quoting. You know, we've figured out enough. Now the opportunity is to look at what we understand and implement it. And yeah, no, well, I hope that, you know, we can collaborate more going forward. I think there's a desire on both sides for cross-pollinating. I think what you've been doing in the nutrition world is just completely epic. I mean, just you've literally been there since the beginning, you know, with the elders who founded the space and have digested it all and are really, you know, in a thought leadership position. And what you've done with your test, again, so I don't know, practical, just practical. So thank you for all of your work and all of your. I hope people are inspired to look at your books, follow your, you know, website link, and yeah, and stay connected and see how we can do more well together. So
Humanity is
Patrick.
wonderful. Thank you, Dan.
all right.